Holy and gracious God, we ask your blessing upon this time of gathering. Move in this space by your Spirit. We might hear your word this day. Amen. Communion is probably my favorite part of our worship practices. Yes, I like it even more than hymns and special musics and anthems and all of that. I like those a whole lot. I love the experience of communion, how it can bring us together with ourselves in this church, with Christians around the world or those just down the block. How it connects us to our ancestors in the faith. I love the almost poetic language of, on the night he was betrayed, he took the bread. I love passing trays down the aisle, serving one another the bread and the cup. And I love walking up the aisle instead to tear off some bread and dip it into the grape juice. I don't love dipping it in the wine because the flavor profile is weird to me, but to each their own. I even love these small little pre-packaged things we've been using for a little more than a year because they allowed us to come to the table during this pandemic safely and together. I especially love that communion has so many layers of meaning, so much behind this simple seeming act of sharing bread and cup. The layers are so multiple that every time we come together we can have a different meaning behind it as a congregation or as individuals taking that communion. Over the next 5 weeks, I will share this love with you. I will gush about communion, and I hope my appreciation for the sacrament comes out in my preaching. I will also be exploring some of the meanings behind this act, this moment of worship. I will not claim that we can, in 5 mere weeks, plumb all of the possible meanings of communion, but I hope that we'll at least hit some of the major ones as we gather the next couple of weeks. We start this morning by looking at John 6 and John 21, which makes sense because communion is associated usually with the Last Supper, as Trinity said. And John 6 John 21 is, you see the problem, right? As I'm sure you noticed before my lame joke just now, neither of these stories is one we usually think about when we think about communion. Neither one takes place on Jesus' last night on earth, on the night of betrayal and desertion. They're not upper room stories. They are ones to think about when we break the bread and cup. And yet they're as close to communion as the Gospel of John gets. Look, when you get a chance, through the Holy Week portion of John, there's no bread and cup there. There's a feet washing, and then 4 chapters of Jesus praying and talking, but there's no communion in John's Gospel, except these 2 stories. The author of the Gospel of John places his communion meal practices in these 2 texts. John 6, which we're just beginning to look at today. We may or may not do it all 5 weeks, but the lectionary has John 6 the next 5 weeks in a row. John 6 begins with this feeding of the multitude, but continues the rest of the chapter with Jesus talking about himself, declaring, I am, on the lakeshore. That's what it is actually in the Greek, I am. Declaring, I am the bread of life, in the next few verses after we just read. Very much using a communion analogy for the bread shared with the multitude. This is not technically a communion story, but I'll tell you, the words that Jesus talks about in the next few verses influence the theology of communion that developed the early church. The language that we still use for communion and what it means comes in no small part from this feeding story and the verses that follow it. John 21 is a meal story. It's the breakfast on the beach story, one of my favorites. And it's built like communion. Jesus prepares the meal and shares it. And even in that last verse, he takes the bread and takes the fish and then gives it to them. Much like he takes the bread and takes the cup before sharing it in the synoptics. The disciples are encouraged to see the risen Christ on the beach, to see Jesus in the bread and the fish, and recognize the risen Christ in that simple meal. Indeed, recent scholarship has suggested that this particular story led to an early communion practice of the early church that didn't feature a cup at all, that didn't center around the Last Supper story, but around this one instead, where the worshipers gathered and shared bread and fish to remember the risen Christ. Now, I'm sort of happy that didn't stick, because preparing a fish meal once a month for us as a worshiping congregation would be a bit much. But I sort of wish the ordinariness of this rite was what we would retain. The idea that communion can be more than just the upper room stream. Because the last night of Jesus' life, the night he was betrayed, the night he went to the garden and wept, that Judas came to him with a kiss, the night that led to the trial and the cross and the tomb, and 3 days later to Easter morning, that's a momentous night. That's a big night. There's a reason we recognize that night over a 3-day weekend, 4-day weekend, and come to church 3 times in 4 days or more. And when we put our communion rite, sacrament, in that story, it might feel like we have to have communion rooted in big special events, which I get, and I sort of affirm. As I said in my introduction, I love communion. And it's a special moment. But it's also meant to be rooted not just in special times, but in ordinary times. Indeed, in one of the most ordinary and common times of our life as humans, mealtime. Jesus ate a lot in the Gospels. He ate with Pharisees and tax collectors, with prostitutes and teachers of the law. He ate with the disciples alone, like in last week's text. He ate with large crowds, feeding the multitude, in all 4 Gospels, and a couple of them more than once. These meal times, these meal traditions, give root to both this morning's text from John 6 and others. To both John 6 and 21 and a more traditional story. Jesus feeding multitude is a big deal. John calls it a sign and theologizes about it for several more verses after this story. But it's also a continuation of something Jesus has been doing in the other Gospels. Jesus sharing a meal. The breakfast on the beach is a cool story. The disciples recognize the presence of the risen Christ in fish and bread. But that recognition can only come because they've done it before. They have eaten with Jesus, and eating is a part of how they have journeyed together. So they recognize him in this familiar task of breaking bread and cooking fish. The Last Supper is a big deal. But it's also just one meal among many in the Synoptic Gospels. It is the culmination of the meal-sharing practices of Jesus found in the Gospels. Communion is an important meal in the life of the church, but it's also just a meal. We shouldn't forget that. The early church didn't. We don't know for sure what communion looked like in the early church, the first 2 centuries of Christianity, but based on what we can read, it almost certainly included both a rite, like the words of Paul in 1 Corinthians, and a real consumed meal. They would break bread ritually and then break bread together over a real table, sharing a real nourishing meal. Communion early church as a meal with Christ and a real meal with each other. Okay, so why am I sharing all of this theologizing and theory about communion? One, is to set groundwork for the other 4 weeks of the sermon series, but also because I want us to reclaim the idea that communion can happen in many forms, at many times, and in many places. And I think one of the best ways to do that is to remember that it is a meal. Because communion in worship is not the only time we can have a meal with Jesus. Other holy meals exist in our lives if we're able to open our eyes and see them. The easiest example is funeral meals. Perhaps not every time, because life is messier than that, but many times, even most times, these are holy meals. The family and friends who have just gone through a ritual and rite of release and remembrance keep the memories going, the remembrance going, by sharing stories, by connecting with one another, by supporting each other in common loss, in common life. It is a holy meal, a time where the divine is present. And while we may never call it communion, it feels very much to me like a meal with Jesus. The church picnic is a holy meal. Countless hours are put into it by a large portion of y'all. Effort and imagination and time and energy are poured into the food and the event. It's done to raise money for Christian education programs, but it's also done so we can share a meal together. And when it occurs year after year, we do spend time together. We laugh, we reminisce, we watch our kids enjoy their church, and our grandkids and our other kids. We break bread and form community together. Friends, I'm not sure I want to call it communion. Maybe. But it is a holy time. It is a meal with Jesus. Indeed, as I told the kids in the front here, almost every meal can be a meal with Jesus. Not just those that hold special importance in the life of our church or congregation. Now, not every meal will feel like that. Sometimes we're just grabbing food to go or too tired to look for Jesus Christ. When we stop and pray, when we look around at our family and friends who sit at table with us, when we open our eyes and our spirits to see the Jesus who is always with us, well then our seemingly ordinary meals, our family meals, all of the times we break bread together can be holy meals, for Jesus is there. Should we call it communion? Depends how you define it. But they are, or at least they can be, holy meals, meals with Jesus. And that's pretty close. Jesus gathered his disciples to eat a meal in an upper room, at tables in Galilee and all along the road to Jerusalem, with 5,000 people and more, and alone at breakfast on a lonely beach. Jesus gathers with his followers still, with us, inviting us to this table, our communion table as a congregation, but also gathering with us in our more ordinary moments. And each time we break bread, offering us a chance for all of them to be holy meals, to be meals with Jesus. What a gift. Let us break bread together. Amen. Let us sing.